The ribbon was red. Theodora Reed stood in the center of Clyde Graves's kitchen with her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her fingertips, staring at that small, crimson ribbon coiled in the palm of his 8-year-old daughter's hand like a secret made visible. Clyde had gone rigid in the doorway behind her. She could feel the heat of his presence, the weight of his stare, and she did not dare turn around. Not yet. Because if she turned around, she would have to explain. And explaining meant unraveling every careful lie she had woven since the moment she arrived in Harlan's Creek, Texas, in the spring of 1882. Nora Graves, small and sharp-eyed and wearing a flour-dusted apron, looked up at Theodora with the most knowing expression a child had any right to possess. She pressed the ribbon into Theodora's hand, closed her small fingers around it, and then, God help her, the girl winked. A slow, deliberate, conspiratorial wink, as though the two of them shared something sacred that no one else in the world was permitted to know. And they did. Theodora felt the betrayal of it like a knife between her ribs. Not Nora's betrayal, never Nora's, it was her own. The dark past she had ridden 140 miles on a borrowed horse to escape had just been compressed into one tiny scrap of scarlet silk and placed back into her hands by a child who trusted her completely. Theodora, Clyde's voice was low, controlled, the way a man's voice gets when he is trying very hard not to shout. Where did that ribbon come from? She knew she had to turn around. She knew she had to face him. Because the man standing behind her deserved nothing less than every terrifying, complicated truth she had been hiding since the day she walked into his life, and because the forced choice she had been dreading for 6 weeks had finally arrived, and it was here, and it was now, and there was nowhere left to run. She turned around. Clyde Graves stood in the kitchen doorway with his hat in his hand and dust from the eastern pasture still painted across his jaw, and he was looking at her the way she imagined he looked at a fence line that had come down overnight, measuring the damage, trying to understand the cause. His dark eyes held something she could not quite name. Not anger, not yet. Something that looked dangerously close to hurt. "I need to tell you something," she said. "I need to tell you everything, and I need you to listen before you say a single word, because if you speak before I finish, I will lose my nerve and you will never know the truth, and we will both spend the rest of our lives in the wreckage of this moment." He said nothing. He put his hat on the hook beside the door, pulled out a chair at the kitchen table and sat down. It was the most frightening thing anyone had ever done for her. She pressed the ribbon tight in her fist, breathed in the smell of warm bread and cedar wood, and everything she had somehow allowed herself to begin loving, and started at the beginning. 6 weeks earlier, the stagecoach from San Antonio had been 4 hours late arriving in Harlan's Creek, which meant Theodora Reed stepped off it in the full, punishing blaze of a Texas noon rather than the gentle cool of a morning. She had $3.40 in her coat pocket, a carpet bag with a broken latch held shut by a length of twine, and a letter of introduction addressed to Mr. Harlan Webb, proprietor of Webb's General Merchandise, who had advertised in the San Antonio Express for a shop girl with experience in bookkeeping. She had the experience. She had fabricated none of that. It was the only part of herself she had kept entirely honest. Harlan's Creek was the kind of town that looked smaller than it was until you were standing in the middle of it. The main street was wide enough for 2 wagons to pass without trouble, and both sides were lined with the usual architecture of frontier commerce. A barber, a hotel of questionable reputation, a land office, a livery, 2 saloons, one respectable and one decidedly not, and Webb's General Merchandise at the far northern end, distinguishable from its neighbors by the large glass window in front, a luxury that Theodora had heard cost Mr. Webb an extraordinary amount of money to have freighted in from Dallas. She walked the length of the main street with her carpetbag banging against her knee and tried to look like a woman who had not just spent the last 3 days running for her life. The shop was cool and smelled of tobacco and dried herbs and the pleasant, dusty smell of bolted cotton fabric. Mr. Webb was a small, round, bespectacled man of about 50 who looked at her letter, looked at her, and then looked at his wife, who was standing behind the counter pretending to arrange a display of ribbon spools with great concentration. "You have actual ledger experience?" he asked. "3 years. Whitmore Dry Goods, San Antonio. I kept the accounts, managed inventory, and corresponded with suppliers. All of it true. All of it ending 8 days ago when she had fled the city with 2 hours' notice and a heart full of terror." "You are not married?" Mrs. Webb inquired without looking up from the ribbon spools. "No, ma'am." References. The one letter she had managed to collect from Mr. Whitmore before she left was folded inside the envelope with the advertisement. She produced it. Mrs. Webb read it with the careful attention of a woman who had been disappointed before, and then handed it back with a slight nod that Theodora took to mean she had passed. She was hired at $6 per week, which was fair, and given a room above the dry goods store, which was small but had a lock on the door, which was all she required. She worked quietly. She kept excellent accounts. She was polite to the customers and careful with the money, and she asked no questions about anyone, and she answered very few about herself. She said she was from San Antonio, which was true. She said she was 26 years old, which was true. She said she had no family to speak of, which was true in every way that mattered. The town accepted her the way frontier towns accepted useful newcomers, with a certain practical courtesy and a suspended judgment that would either convert into genuine warmth or gentle exclusion over the course of several months. Theodora was accustomed to this. She was good at earning warmth gradually. She had been doing it her entire life. She met Clyde Graves on her 5th day in Harlan's Creek. He came into the store on a Tuesday morning for a sack of flour, a tin of lard, a length of fence wire, and a bottle of cod liver oil, and he set all 4 items on the counter with the decisive efficiency of a man who knew exactly what he needed and did not intend to waste anyone's time. He was perhaps 30, perhaps 32, with the kind of lean, weathered build that came from genuine physical labor rather than artifice, dark hair in need of a barber's attention, and eyes the particular deep brown of good creek water and shade. He was not immediately arresting. He was not the kind of man who commanded a room. But there was something settled about him, something solid and unhurried in the way he stood, that Theodora noticed in the way you notice a well-built wall, with a quiet appreciation for the craft of it. He counted out the correct money without being told the total, which meant he had bought these items before and remembered the prices, which meant he was methodical, which she appreciated. "You are the new girl," he said. It was not a question. In a town of 400, a new face was news. "I am Theodora Reed," she said. "I started Monday." "Clyde Graves," he said. "I run the Double G Ranch 3 miles east of town." He looked at her with the same measuring expression she would come to know very well, then said, "You have good handwriting," with a nod toward the ledger she had been updating when he walked in. "Thank you," she said. "My daughter traced her name in the dust on my writing desk this morning. She cannot read yet. I have been meaning to find someone to teach her." He picked up his packages. "I don't suppose that is a service you provide." "Not as part of my employment here," Theodora said carefully. "But I could be persuaded to give lessons in the evenings, if the arrangement suited all parties." He studied her for a moment with those creekwater eyes. Then he gave a single small nod, the way a man gives a nod when he has weighed something and found it adequate. "Saturday morning," he said. "Bring whatever books you require. I'll pay the same rate as the school teacher in Comanche charges, which is 25 cents an hour." And then he picked up his purchases and walked out of the store, and Theodora stood at the counter and thought, well, that was something. She arrived at the Double G Ranch on a borrowed horse on the following Saturday at 9 in the morning, and found it larger than she had expected and more orderly. The house was a solid 2-story structure of limestone and cedar. The yard was swept, the barn was painted, and the fence lines were straight and well maintained. A working ranch that was also, somehow, a home. Someone had planted roses along the front of the porch, deep red ones just coming into early bloom, and the sight of them caught in her throat in a way she did not entirely expect. Nora Graves came bursting off the porch before Theodora had fully dismounted, a small force of nature in a brown calico dress with her dark hair escaping its braids in approximately 6 places. She was 6 years old. Theodora would later learn she was actually 8, but she was small for her age and moved with the energy of something twice her size, and she grabbed Theodora's free hand the moment her boot hit the ground and said, "Are you the teacher? Papa said you were coming. I already know my letters up to the letter G. Papa taught me G because it is our letter. Is your name a G?" "It is not," Theodora said. "My name begins with T. That is a different letter, but I can teach you that one too." "T," Nora repeated, tasting it. "Like the hot drink. Exactly like that." Nora grinned with the unfiltered delight of a child who has just made a connection, grabbed her hand more firmly, and towed her up the porch steps. Clyde was waiting inside, having clearly made some effort in the time since Tuesday. The front room was tidy. A fire was burning low in the hearth against the morning chill, and there was a small table set up near the window with 2 chairs and a clean lamp. He had thought about where the light would fall. Theodora noticed this and filed it away without comment. "Coffee," he offered. "Please," she said. He made excellent coffee, dark and strong and served without ceremony in a heavy ceramic mug. She wrapped both hands around it and looked at the table he had prepared and felt, for the first time in over a week, something adjacent to safe. The lessons became a Saturday fixture. Then, because Nora was the kind of child who treated any resistance to her schemes as a temporary obstacle rather than a final answer, they became a Wednesday evening fixture as well. And because Theodora's own evenings were otherwise spent in a small room above a dry goods store, trying not to think about what she had left behind in San Antonio, she did not object. Clyde was present for every lesson without being intrusive. He worked nearby, at the writing desk in the corner, going over his ranch accounts or reading or mending leather, and after the first few sessions, Theodora stopped noticing him consciously and started noticing him the way you notice weather, as a steady, ambient presence that had an effect on the atmosphere without declaring itself. She learned things about him the way you learn things about a private person, slowly, in pieces. He had been married. His wife, a woman named Clara, had died of a fever when Nora was 3 years old. He did not speak of this directly. It came out in the negative spaces of conversation, in the way Nora occasionally said things like, "Papa says Mama would have liked that." In the way there was a small oval portrait on the mantel that Theodora never saw him look at directly, but never saw him take down either. He carried the loss the way you carry a healed fracture, always present in the bone, occasionally aching in particular weather, no longer the defining emergency it had once been. He ran the Double G with 2 hired hands, brothers named Emmett and Frank Collier, who were competent and cheerful and treated Theodora with the straightforward respect due to someone their employer appeared to have sanctioned. He had 230 head of cattle and a contract to supply beef to the railroad camps pushing west through the hill country, and he managed his finances with the same methodical precision he applied to everything else. He asked her almost nothing about herself. This should have felt strategic. It should have felt suspicious, the careful courtesy of a man biding his time. But it did not feel that way. It felt, instead, like the particular courtesy of a person who understood that privacy was not a luxury but a necessity, and who extended it to others because he required it himself. She found it, against all reasonable judgment, the most attractive quality she had encountered in a human being in her adult life. By the end of the 3rd week, Nora could read 12 words independently and write her full name in letters that, while generous in their proportions, were entirely legible. She celebrated this achievement by running through the kitchen where Theodora was packing her teaching materials on a Wednesday evening and pressing something into her hand with the speed and intensity of a small conspirator. It was a blue hair ribbon. "That was Mama's," Nora said. with the complete seriousness of a child making an important declaration. "Papa keeps it in the box on the high shelf, but I think you should have it, because you are nice and you make him talk more." And then she ran back out of the kitchen before Theodora could respond. Theodora stood holding the ribbon and felt the specific, complicated grief of receiving something precious from a child who did not fully understand what they were giving away. She folded it carefully into her apron pocket. She would find a way to return it without making it feel like a rejection. She would be tactful, she would be gentle, she never returned it. Because the following Saturday, when she arrived at the ranch, she found Clyde on the porch with a thundercloud expression that she had not seen before, and before she could even dismount properly, he said, in a low, controlled voice, "There is something I need to tell you, and I am going to tell you now rather than after the lesson because I cannot think straight until I do." She got off the horse. She tied the reins to the porch post. She said, "All right. There is a man in town asking questions about you," he said. "He arrived yesterday on the evening stage. He went to the hotel first and then to the saloon, and then apparently to every establishment on the main street, asking after a woman named Theodora Reed from San Antonio." The blood left her face in a single vertiginous rush. "He found me," she said. The words came out of her mouth before she could stop them, flat and final as a verdict. "Who is he?" Clyde's voice was still that controlled, low tone, but there was something underneath it now. Something that was not anger exactly but was adjacent to it. Something protective. "And what does he want with you?" She looked at the roses blooming along the porch railing. She looked at the door of the house where Nora was waiting inside, completely trusting, ready for her letters. She thought about the dark past she had spent 10 days trying to outrun, and about how it had followed her anyway, and about how it always did, and she said, "His name is Douglas Hale. He is the man I was engaged to be married to, and I left him 3 weeks before the wedding, and I suspect he is not particularly pleased about it." Clyde looked at her for a long moment. "Were you in danger?" he asked. "Not physically," she said carefully, "but there are other kinds of danger, and some of them have legal remedies that Douglas Hale's family has the money to pursue." His family. "His father is Emery Hale. He owns 3 banks and a cotton brokerage in San Antonio, and he has a great deal of influence over a great many things, including, I have been given to understand, at least 2 judges." Clyde was quiet. He looked at the road into town. Then he said, "Go in and start the lesson. I need to think." She went in. She sat down with Nora, and she read aloud from the McGuffey's reader, and she helped the child trace letters on her slate, and she did not let a single fragment of her terror show on her face, because she had become extremely good at presenting a calm exterior over a landscape of chaos, and she was not going to frighten this child, or let the darkness of her situation contaminate this small, bright Wednesday morning. But inside she was calculating rapidly. She had $3.40 when she arrived in Harlan's Creek. She now had closer to 12 after 3 weeks' wages. That was enough for a stagecoach ticket to Fort Worth, maybe further if she was careful. She could leave tonight. She could be gone before Douglas Hale finished asking questions. She had done it before. The thought made her feel sick, because the truth she had not admitted even to herself yet, the truth she was now being forced to confront with considerable speed, was that she did not want to leave. She had spent 6 weeks building something in Harlan's Creek that felt in its bones like the beginning of a life, not an escape, not a temporary shelter, a life. And most of that feeling had to do with a man who made strong coffee and asked her almost nothing and had dark creekwater eyes and had apparently, in the space of 12 hours, learned that someone was hunting her and was already standing on his porch thinking about what to do about it. She pressed her hand flat against her apron pocket where the blue ribbon was folded, and she breathed, and she kept reading. Clyde came back inside during the lesson's final 20 minutes. He sat at his writing desk and said nothing, and when Nora had been sent to wash up for lunch and Theodora was packing her materials, he said quietly, "He is at the Harlan Hotel. He has hired 2 men to assist him with whatever he is here to do. One of them is the kind of man who carries a shotgun on his lap in a restaurant." She pressed the reader into her bag. "I should leave. Where would you go? Fort Worth or further?" And then, she did not answer because the answer was obvious. She would find another town and another job and another small room, and she would start again. And Douglas Hale or someone like him would eventually find her again, because men like Douglas Hale did not accept being embarrassed and had the resources to pursue their grievances indefinitely. "Why did you leave him?" Clyde asked. She looked up from her bag. He was watching her from across the room with his elbows on the writing desk and his hands folded together, and an expression that was careful and serious and entirely without judgment. "Because he was not a good man," she said. "He was a man who was good at appearing good, which is a different thing entirely. He kept his worst qualities very well hidden until the engagement was settled, and the family had made the announcement in the newspaper, and retreating would require a degree of courage and inconvenience that he assumed I did not possess." She paused. "He underestimated me." Something moved through Clyde's eyes. What was he hiding? A temper. A habit of making promises he had no intention of keeping. A particular view of women as property to be managed rather than people to be partnered. She looked at the window. And a separate arrangement with a woman in Galveston that he had neglected to mention during our courtship. The air in the room went very still. "He is pursuing you for breach of promise," Clyde said slowly. "That is the legal remedy you mentioned." "He is pursuing me because he cannot stand the fact that I left," she said. "The legal mechanism is breach of promise, yes. His family believes it reflects badly on them, and they want a resolution that does not involve public acknowledgement that their son was faithless first." "What resolution?" "Either I return and the wedding proceeds, or I sign a document confessing to breach of promise and pay a financial settlement that I manifestly cannot afford, or I am brought back to San Antonio by whatever means his hired men deem appropriate." She said it flatly, because she had been staring at these options for 10 days, and the flatness was the only thing that kept her functional. The law in Texas allows a certain amount of latitude in the recovery of runaway breach of promise defendants, particularly when the plaintiff's family has influence. Clyde stood up. He was quiet for a long moment in the way of a man doing serious internal arithmetic. "Stay," he said. She stared at him. "I beg your pardon, stay here at the ranch. You are safer here than in town, and if you leave Harlan's Creek you lose every advantage you have, which right now is limited, but it is not nothing. You know where you are. He does not yet know where you are specifically." He paused. "I have a spare bedroom. Nora will be delighted. It will not be a scandal, Mrs. Webb will confirm you are employed, and if anyone asks inappropriate questions, the women of this town are considerably more ferocious than Douglas Hale appears to have accounted for." She looked at him. He looked back. It was one of those moments where something invisible but significant shifts, like a door opening in a room you thought was a wall. "Why?" she asked. The question hung between them. It was not a small question. "Because you are being hunted for doing nothing wrong," he said. "And because this is my land and my house, and within it I am able to make choices about what I will and will not permit to happen." He picked up his hat from the hook. "And because Nora needs her teacher." He said the last part as though it settled the matter, and in the particular economy of a man like Clyde Graves, it apparently did. She stayed. She moved her carpetbag and her few possessions from the room above Webb's general merchandise to the spare bedroom at the Double G Ranch the following morning, and she did it with the barely controlled efficiency of someone packing quickly in case the situation changed its mind. Mrs. Webb was understanding in the brisk, practical way of a woman who had seen trouble before and knew that practical solutions mattered more than perfectly observed propriety. She told Mr. Webb that Theodora's services would continue on the same schedule, and that any gossip about the living arrangement should be discouraged, because that young woman has enough trouble without us adding to it. And Mr. Webb, who had learned decades ago to trust his wife's read on people, agreed immediately. The spare bedroom at the Double G was larger than her room at the shop. It had a window that faced east and caught the morning light, and someone, at some point in the room's history, had painted the ceiling beams a faded barn red that gave the room a warm, enclosed feeling she had not expected and found, against her better judgment, immediately comforting. She lay awake that first night listening to the ranch settle around her, the distant sound of cattle, the creak of the house in the wind, the small domestic sounds of a building that was genuinely inhabited rather than merely occupied, and she felt the particular vertigo of finding herself somewhere she had not intended to go but which felt, inexplicably, like somewhere she was supposed to be. Douglas Hale was still in town. He had made discreet inquiries at Webb's General Merchandise, where Mrs. Webb had informed him pleasantly, and with absolute conviction that Miss Reed had left Harlan's Creek on Thursday's stage, and she believed the destination had been Abilene. He had, according to Emmett Collier, who had ears everywhere, been persuaded of this account and was considering his next move, which might involve going to Abilene or might involve asking more questions locally. Either way, Theodora had bought herself some time in which, against every reasonable instruction she gave herself, she kept settling in. She cooked breakfast on the second morning because she woke before anyone else, and the kitchen was there, and she knew how, and it seemed wasteful not to. When Clyde came downstairs to find eggs and corn bread and strong coffee already made, he stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment with an expression she could not fully read, and then he said, "You didn't have to do that," and she said, "I know," and they ate together in the early morning quiet, and it felt like something that had been happening for years. Nora treated Theodora's presence in the house as a personal triumph, which perhaps it was. She knocked on Theodora's door in the mornings to show her interesting things she had found: a hawk feather, a quartz stone with a vein of pink in it, a lizard she had named Gerald. She asked Theodora to braid her hair because her braids, she explained with frank diplomacy, never came out right when Papa did them. She included Theodora in her conversations about the ranch animals with the uncomplicated assumption of someone who has already decided that you belong. Clyde watched all of this without comment. When Theodora caught him watching, he would look back at whatever he had been doing. He was not a man who said things before he had thought them through completely, and she had begun to respect this the way she respected well-built walls, as evidence of craftsmanship applied to character. They talked in the evenings, after Nora was in bed. Initially about practical matters, the situation in town, the ranch's needs, the weather, then, gradually, about other things. He told her about growing up on a smaller homestead 2 counties north, about learning to run cattle from his father, about the years he spent working other men's ranges before he had enough saved to buy the Double G's first acres. She told him about growing up in a family of modest means in Austin, about her mother who taught her to read and her father who taught her that hard work and good accounts were the closest things to security that common people possessed. She told him about going to San Antonio at 19 to work, about the years of careful saving and skill building, about meeting Douglas Hale at a dinner given by her employer, about the courtship that had seemed, at the time, like a remarkable piece of luck, and had turned out to be something considerably more complicated. She did not tell him the worst of it, not yet. The parts that she was still ashamed of, not because she had done anything wrong, but because shame is not rational and does not require guilt to take root. He listened the way he did everything else, with complete, unhurried attention. On the 10th day of her stay at the Double G, he told her something he had clearly been working up to for several days. "Douglas Hale's men have been asking about you in the surrounding area," he said. "They were on the porch in the last of the evening light, and there was a nighthawk calling somewhere above the mesquite trees. They spoke to Jensen at the livery. Jensen said he didn't know you, which was true, but they apparently described you in some detail. Hair, height, age." She nodded. She had expected this. "There is also a legal matter I thought you should know about," he continued. "Frank Collier's cousin works at the land office." He overheard Hale making inquiries about the legal process for compelling a breach of promise defendant to appear in a San Antonio court. He apparently has a judge in that city who will issue the order on his family's behalf. I know about that process, she said. If the order is issued and served on me, I have two choices. Appear in the San Antonio court, where the Hale family's influence will ensure the outcome they want, or remain hidden long enough for the statute of limitations on breach of promise claims to expire, which in Texas is 2 years. She paused. I cannot hide for 2 years. No, he agreed. He was looking at the horizon. But you could fight it. She looked at him. With what resources? I have $12, Clyde. He turned and looked at her directly. I know a lawyer in Fredericksburg, he said. A good one, a man who has handled similar cases and who has a particular interest in questioning the fairness of breach of promise law as it applies to women. He paused. I wrote to him last week. The Nighthawk called again. She was aware of the specific quality of the silence between them. You wrote to him, she said slowly. I did. Last week. Yes. She thought about what it meant, that he had done this before she asked, before she even knew she might need it, had simply identified a problem and begun moving to address it with the same quiet, methodical competence he brought to everything else. Why? She asked, and it was the same question she had asked before, but it meant something different now. He was quiet for a long moment. The stars were beginning to show above the eastern pasture. She could smell the roses from the front of the porch, and the distant, dry, warm smell of cattle, and the cedar and coffee smell that she had started to associate specifically with him. Because I would like you to stay, he said. Not in the way that I would like a useful employee to stay. In the other way. He said it with the plain-spoken directness of a man who found evasiveness more trouble than it was worth, and had decided, once and finally, to stop practicing it. I am aware that this is a great deal to lay on a person who is already dealing with considerable difficulty, and I do not say it to add pressure. I say it because I find dishonesty, even the polite kind, more uncomfortable than the alternative. Theodora looked at the stars appearing one by one above the pasture, and felt the precise shape of the forbidden thing she had been refusing to name for 2 weeks. It was not small. It was not a manageable affection. It was the large, unreasonable, frightening kind, the kind that upended calculations and made you willing to do things you had sworn you would never do again. I have very bad judgment about men, she said. I know, he said. You told me about your father's lesson on careful accounting. You have excellent judgment about almost everything else. I suspect the trouble with men is less about your judgment and more about the fact that the wrong ones are very good at appearing to be the right ones. And you are going to tell me that you are actually the right one. No, he said. I am going to tell you that I know exactly who I am and I will not hide any of it, and you are free to make whatever judgment you like based on accurate information. She turned to look at him. He was watching her with those steady, creekwater eyes and the particular patience of a man who has learned to wait for things worth waiting for. All right, she said. Then I would like to know who you are, he told her. Over the following hour, sitting on the porch in the growing dark, he told her things she did not think he told many people. About the years after Clara died, when he almost lost the ranch because grief had made him careless. About the specific, grinding loneliness of raising a child alone in a place where everyone knew your history and watched your recovery as though it were a performance. About the particular difficulty of learning to want a future again when the one you had planned had dissolved. He was not a man who used many words. But the words he chose were precise and undecorated and true, and by the time he was finished, she understood him in the way you understand something you have been looking at indirectly and then finally allow yourself to see clearly. I don't know what to do with any of that, she said honestly. You don't have to do anything with it tonight, he said. Tonight you just know. She went inside, and she did not sleep for a very long time, and she thought about forbidden things and dark pasts, and the terrifying particular nature of hope when it arrives in circumstances that seem specifically designed to deny it. Douglas Hale made his presence known in a direct way 11 days after Theodora moved to the ranch. He appeared at the gate of the Double G in the early morning, a tall man in a good suit that was considerably less impressive after the Texas dust had finished with it, accompanied by one of his hired men, the one, Clyde had said, who carried the shotgun at mealtimes. The other hired man was presumably elsewhere. Theodora was in the kitchen making breakfast. Clyde was at the barn. Nora came running in from the porch where she had been feeding the chickens and said breathlessly, "There are men at the gate. They look like city men. They look rude." Theodora dried her hands on her apron. She felt the cold clarity that terror eventually produces when you have been afraid long enough. She was not going to hide in the kitchen. She was not going to run. She had been running for 3 weeks and she was finished with it. She walked out onto the porch. Douglas Hale looked older than she remembered, or perhaps the dust and the failure of his pursuit had aged him temporarily. He was a handsome man in the conventional sense, with even features and good clothes and a carefully constructed air of reasonable authority, and she had once been thoroughly fooled by all of it. "Theodora," he said from the gate, "I am glad to see you well." "Douglas," she said. She kept her voice entirely level. "You have wasted considerable money and travel time finding me. I am sorry I cannot offer you a better return on the investment." "I am here to talk about our arrangement," he said. "Specifically about resolving the matter in a way that does not require further legal involvement." "There is nothing to resolve," she said. "I did not breach our arrangement." "You did when you established a relationship with a woman in Galveston while still engaged to me. I declined to enter a marriage with a man who had already proven himself faithless, and I declined to remain in a city where your family's influence would make fair treatment of my position impossible. None of that constitutes breach of promise." Douglas Hale's jaw tightened in the way it used to tighten when she said something he had not expected and could not immediately counter. "There is a judge in San Antonio who will see it differently. There is a lawyer in Fredericksburg who will be interested to hear about the woman in Galveston," said a voice behind her. She had not heard Clyde come up from the barn. He was standing to her left, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, and he was looking at Douglas Hale with the steady, level attention of a man who has already assessed the situation and found it unimpressive. "I believe her name is Margaret Crane. Her address, I am told, is on Seeley Street." He let that sit for a moment. "My lawyer is very thorough." The hired man with the shotgun shifted his weight. Clyde looked at him once briefly, and the man went still. Douglas Hale looked between them. Theodora watched him recalculate, the way she had seen him do it before in drawing rooms and over dinner tables, that particular assessment of risk and advantage that was really all his relationships had ever been. "You are making this more complicated than it needs to be," he said, but the authority in his voice had gone slightly thin. "I think the appropriate word is accurate," Clyde said. "You arrived here with a legal mechanism designed to compel a woman to either submit to a marriage she does not want or pay a financial penalty she cannot afford, in service of your family's social preference, while being aware that the original breach was your own. I think that is complicated. I think it was designed to be." He paused. "I think you should go back to San Antonio, and I think your lawyer should communicate with my lawyer from this point forward." Douglas Hale looked at Theodora. She looked back at him, and she felt nothing that she had once feared she would feel. No old pull of the comfortable familiar. No residual grief for what she had thought they were building. Nothing but the clear-eyed recognition of a man who had never actually known her and had never particularly wanted to. "Goodbye, Douglas," she said. He left. Not happily and not with any particular grace, but he left, and the hired man left with him, and they rode back toward town in the direction of the stage route. Clyde stood on the porch beside her until they were out of sight. Then he said, "Are you all right?" "I am better than I have been in a month," she said. He made a small sound that was almost a laugh. It was the first time she had heard it. The lawyer in Fredericksburg, whose name was Calvin Merritt, arrived by stage 2 weeks later. He was a thin, angular man with spectacles and ink-stained fingers, and a manner so aggressively precise that he made Theodora feel, for the first time in the entire ordeal, genuinely hopeful. He had already written to 2 colleagues in San Antonio. He had already made inquiries about Margaret Crane of Seeley Street, who had, it turned out, a great deal to say about Douglas Hale's conduct, given the appropriate legal assurance that her cooperation would be protected. He told Theodora, in the front room of the Double G while Nora pretended to read in the corner and Clyde sat at the writing desk with his arms folded, that he believed the breach of promise case had very little legal merit if Douglas Hale's prior infidelity could be documented, which it now could, and that furthermore there were questions about the validity of the engagement contract itself that he would enjoy raising in any court that proved willing to hear them. He said he would handle the matter for a reduced fee because he found it interesting, and because he had been looking for a test case on exactly these legal questions for some time. He shook her hand at the end, which was not something male lawyers generally did with female clients, and said he would be in touch, and then he took the afternoon stage back to Fredericksburg. Theodora sat in the front room after he left and felt something unfamiliar moving through her. It took her a moment to identify it. It was the specific quality of a weight being set down after a long carry. Clyde came and sat in the chair across from her. "It is not over," she said. "He will not simply accept this." "No," he agreed, "but the terms have changed. Because of you. Because of a competent lawyer and a woman who had the courage to run rather than surrender," he said with quiet precision. "I only made a letter-writing contribution." She looked at him. He was watching her with that steady, unhurried attention, and she thought about what he had said on the porch that evening, that he would like her to stay in the other way, and she thought about all the things she had been refusing to call by their right names. "I have very bad judgment about men," she said again. "I know," he said. "You mentioned that. But I also have very good judgment about character," she said, "and I have been studying your character quite carefully for 6 weeks." Something shifted in his expression, small but unmistakable. "What is your conclusion?" he asked. She told him. She told him that she had concluded he was honest in the bone-deep way of someone who found dishonesty genuinely uncomfortable rather than strategically inadvisable, that he was patient in the way that comes from genuine security rather than suppression, that he loved his daughter with the complete, undemonstrative devotion of a man who did not need to perform his feelings because he never doubted their reality, that he had treated her, from the first Tuesday when she sold him flour and fence wire, as a person worth taking seriously. "That is," she said, "a great deal rarer than it should be." He stood up and crossed the room, and she stood up to meet him, and he took her face in his hands very gently and kissed her. It was not a tentative kiss. It was the kiss of a man who had thought about it a great deal and was entirely certain of his direction once he had finally committed to it. She felt the warmth of it through her whole body, from her throat to the soles of her feet. Nora made a sound from the corner. They separated. Nora was sitting with her book face down in her lap, and her expression was one of absolute, comprehensive satisfaction, the satisfaction of a child who has orchestrated a successful outcome. "I put the blue ribbon in your pocket," she said to Theodora, with the calm pride of a very small general reviewing a successful campaign, "a long time ago, because Papa kept looking at you when he thought you weren't watching, and I decided that was a sign." Theodora looked at the child and felt her heart do something complicated. "You are 8 years old," she said. "I know," said Nora serenely, and picked up her book. The 3 months that followed were the most unexpectedly complete that Theodora Reed had experienced in her adult life. Calvin Merritt's legal campaign proceeded with the methodical efficiency of a man who understood the law as a precision instrument. He documented Douglas Hale's relationship with Margaret Crane of Seeley Street in careful, undeniable detail. He raised questions about the engagement contract's validity. He wrote to the judge whom Hale's family had engaged and introduced the concept of counter-litigation, specifically a suit on Theodora's behalf against Douglas Hale for fraudulent misrepresentation during the courtship. which had sufficient merit to be genuinely alarming to the Hale family's lawyers. In July of 1882, a letter arrived from San Antonio signed by a law firm Theodora recognized as one of the city's most expensive, advising that Douglas Hale had decided not to pursue the breach of promise claim further, in the interest of resolving the matter privately and without additional legal expense. There was a formal release attached, to be signed by both parties, and a very short, very cold note from Douglas Hale himself that said only, "I hope you are satisfied with the outcome you have created." She was. She was profoundly and entirely satisfied with the outcome she had created. She signed the release on the writing desk in the front room of the Double G Ranch, with Clyde standing beside her and Nora sitting on the floor nearby, constructing an elaborate architectural project with a set of wooden building blocks, and she felt the last strand of her dark past snap clean. She cried. She had not cried in months, not since the night she fled San Antonio, and now she sat in a chair in a limestone ranch house in the Texas Hill Country and cried with the specific relief of someone who has survived something that seemed very likely to be unsurvivable. Clyde sat on the arm of the chair and put his arm around her and said nothing, which was exactly the right thing. Nora abandoned her blocks and climbed into her lap and put both arms around her neck and held on, which was also exactly the right thing. The days moved forward with the particular sweetness of ordinary life when you have recently been reminded that it is not guaranteed. She continued the lessons with Nora, who could now read 3 pages of the McGuffey's Reader without stopping to ask for help, and who was beginning to write with a legibility and an enthusiasm that would have charmed the most skeptical schoolteacher. She continued working at Webb's General Merchandise 3 days a week, keeping the accounts, corresponding with suppliers, and periodically helping Mrs. Webb rearrange the ribbon display in ways that Mrs. Webb's arthritic hands found difficult. She cooked breakfast at the ranch most mornings and was learning to make Clyde's preferred biscuits, which required a particular hand with the lard that she had not yet fully mastered but was determinedly pursuing. She and Clyde fell into the easy patterns of 2 people who discover with some surprise that they inhabit the same rhythms. He rose early, so did she. He was comfortable with silence, so was she. He found direct speech more efficient than elaborate circumlocution. She agreed with this. He thought carefully before committing to a position and then committed to it fully. She did the same. They rode out to check the fence lines on Sunday afternoons when the ranch work permitted it, just the 2 of them, while Emmett Collier's wife, a cheerful, sensible woman named Beatrice, stayed with Nora and taught her to braid. They talked on these rides in the relaxed, ranging way that long acquaintance allows, about the ranch and about the town, and about the history of the country they were riding through, and about what they thought the future held, both generally and specifically. He asked her to marry him on a Sunday afternoon in late September, on a limestone ridge above the eastern pasture with the hill country spreading out below them in every direction and the light going golden and the mesquite trees smelling of warmth and drought and the particular dry sweetness of the Texas autumn. He did not make a speech. He was not a man who made speeches. He said, "I would like to marry you, Theodora, if you are willing. I think we would be good at it." She considered this for a moment. The ridge, the light, the smell. The man beside her with his hands loose on the saddle horn and his Creekwater eyes serious and certain, and already patient with whatever answer she was preparing to give. "I think we would be good at it too," she said. He smiled. It was the full version, the one she had been seeing in glimpses for weeks, and it changed his face in the way that full smiles always change a private person's face, by revealing the warmth underneath the reserve. He reached into his vest pocket and produced a ring that she did not immediately recognize, a plain gold band set with a small oval turquoise stone, very simple and very exactly right. "That was my grandmother's," he said. She was a woman who had a great deal of good sense and a remarkable ability to outlast difficult circumstances. I thought it was appropriate. She held out her hand, and he slid it onto her finger and it fit as though it had been made for her, which seemed like something more than coincidence. They were married in November, in the front room of the Double G Ranch, with Reverend Dawes from the Harlan's Creek Methodist Church presiding, Mrs. Webb dabbing at her eyes in the front row, Emmett and Frank Collier standing in the back in their good shirts, and Nora standing beside Theodora as her chosen attendant, wearing a white hair ribbon in her dark braids, and holding a small bunch of late roses from the porch bushes with the gravity of someone who understood she was participating in something important. Nora had been consulted about the wedding extensively. She had opinions about the roses, about the order of events, about the biscuits that would be served afterward, and about the general principle of the occasion. She had made it clear, in the straightforward way she made most things clear, that she was very pleased, that she had been expecting it, and that she hoped it would mean Theodora would stop saying "your father" and simply say "Clyde," which Theodora was already doing. The ceremony was short and the vows were plain, and when Reverend Dawes pronounced them married, Clyde kissed her in the way he had kissed her in this same room 4 months ago, certain and warm and with complete conviction, and Nora said, "Finally," in a voice that carried to every corner of the room and generated laughter that went on for some time. The weeks after the wedding settled into a new version of the ordinary life that Theodora had been building since she arrived in Harlan's Creek, but filled now with a warmth and a permanence that the previous version had lacked. She moved her possessions, such as they were, from the spare bedroom to the room at the front of the house that Clyde occupied, which was a larger room with 2 east-facing windows and a view of the roses and the road, and she arranged her small collection of books on the shelf beside his larger collection, and looked at them together, and felt the specific satisfaction of things that belonged together being placed together. She quit her position at Webb's General Merchandise in December, because Clyde had asked if she would take over the ranch's financial management, which had been handled adequately but without particular skill by a combination of Clyde's own efforts and a bookkeeper in town who came out once a month. The ranch accounts, once she got into them, turned out to be exactly the kind of organized chaos she was best equipped to address. She spent 2 weeks creating systems that had not existed before and another week training Clyde in their use. And by January, the Double G's financial operations were running with a precision that Clyde found both impressive and mildly alarming. "You are very thorough," he told her, standing behind her at the writing desk with his chin on the top of her head, reading over a supply schedule she had prepared that projected forward through the spring calving. "I am appropriately thorough," she corrected. "I was being far too casual before." He made the almost laugh sound. She had learned by now to love that sound unreasonably. He was teaching her in return the practical operations of the ranch. Not because she needed to know them to manage the accounts, but because she had expressed genuine interest and he was incapable of doing anything carelessly. She learned to read the cattle's condition at a glance, to understand the language of fence and water and pasture rotation, to recognize the particular quality of Texas sky that meant a blue norther was coming in fast, with enough time to get the animals to shelter. She was not a natural horsewoman, but she was a determined one, and by February she could handle the quarter-horse mare Clyde had assigned to her use with enough competence to make an uncritical observer think she had been riding for years, rather than months. Nora continued her lessons with a dedication that Theodora found both gratifying and slightly overwhelming. By December she was reading independently, and by February she had started a journal, a small leather-bound book that Theodora had given her for Christmas, in which she wrote brief daily entries about the ranch animals, the weather, and her observations about the world with the careful hand and the unsentimental clarity that suggested she was going to be a remarkable writer someday. One February morning Theodora found the journal left open on the kitchen table, apparently by accident, at an entry that read, "Today Papa was looking at Theodora while she was reading, and she did not know he was looking. He had the same face he has when he looks at the good pasture after a rain. I think that means he thinks she is good. I think so too. I am glad she came. She closed the journal carefully and put it back where Nora had left it and did not mention it to anyone. But she carried it with her internally for a very long time. Spring came to the hill country with the particular urgency of a season that knows it has to accomplish everything before the summer heat arrives, and the Double G was suddenly full of the productive chaos of calving season. Theodora was in the middle of all of it, not because she had planned to be, but because calving season does not respect plans, and because she was there and capable and genuinely willing. She learned more in those 6 weeks than in the entire previous 8 months combined. She learned to tell by a cow's behavior when she was close to calving and when something was going wrong. She learned that Emmett Collier was worth 2 of most men in a calving pen, and that Frank Collier made up for his slightly lesser skill with an abundance of good-natured endurance. She learned that Clyde in the middle of calving season was even more focused than Clyde in regular time, which was saying something, and that she found this extremely attractive, which she had not anticipated. She also discovered in the middle of calving season that she was pregnant. She told Clyde on a Thursday evening in April after supper, sitting at the kitchen table with her hands folded on the wood and Nora already in bed, and the spring peepers going outside the window. She said it simply, the way she had learned to say most things to him, without decoration. He was quiet for a long moment. She watched his face and saw the sequence of things moving through it, first the information landing, then something that was very large and complex, and which resolved finally into a brightness in his eyes that she had only seen before in certain specific moments of particular gladness. "Are you well?" he asked, his first question. "I am entirely well," she said. "And I am happy about it. I want you to know that I am very happy about it." He stood up, came around the table, sat down in the chair beside her and took both her hands in his and held them in the warm, careful way he held things that mattered. He looked at her for a long moment and then he said, "So am I," and she heard everything that was underneath it. Nora's reaction the following morning was predictably comprehensive. She processed the information for approximately 90 seconds in silence, which was longer than Theodora had expected, and then said, "I would prefer a brother, but if it is a sister, I will teach her the things that matter." "That is very generous of you," Clyde said. "I know," said Nora. The summer of 1883 was hot even by Texas Hill Country standards, and Theodora moved through it with the determined practicality of a woman who has made up her mind not to be defeated by weather or by biology. She continued the ranch accounts. She continued Nora's lessons. She made a series of adjustments to the house, small, practical ones, a better arrangement in the kitchen, a new shelf in the front room, curtains that she and Mrs. Webb made together on a borrowed sewing machine, that transformed the Double G from a well-maintained house to something that was recognizably a home shaped by multiple inhabitants who cared about it. She and Clyde had reached the particular stage of a relationship where the great dramatic sweeps of early feeling had settled into something that was both quieter and deeper. The daily accumulation of small kindnesses and practical cooperation and genuine affection, that is the actual substance of a life built together. And she found it, to her lasting surprise, more sustaining than the dramatic sweeps had ever been. He brought her wildflowers from the pasture in July, not as a gesture, simply because he had been riding past a patch of them and had thought of her, and he laid them on the writing desk without comment and went back outside, and she sat there looking at them for a moment with a feeling in her chest that had no name in any language she knew. She began telling him things she had never told anyone. The years of careful invisibility in San Antonio, making herself small and quiet and unobtrusive, because that was how women in commercial employment survived. The specific loneliness of being competent in a world that found female competence inconvenient. the complicated grief of the engagement to Douglas Hale, which had been not just a betrayal but a loss of a future she had allowed herself to believe in, which was harder in some ways than if she had never believed in it at all. He listened with the complete attention he brought to everything, and when she finished, he said things that were brief and exact, and that demonstrated that he had heard not just the words but the meaning underneath them, which was the only kind of listening that actually helps. She told him about the hidden motive she had slowly understood Douglas Hale to have had, that his family had wanted her specifically, because she had no family of her own to complicate the arrangement, no parents to advocate for her, no brothers to make a scene, no connections to cause inconvenience. She had been chosen for her isolation as much as any other quality, and the understanding of this had taken her a long time to come to and longer still to accept without shame. Clyde said, "You were difficult to isolate, it turns out." She thought about the lawyer in Fredericksburg and the women of Harlan's Creek and Mrs. Webb and Nora and the blue ribbon still folded in her apron pocket and the man sitting across from her who had, with a letter and a kitchen table and two plain chairs and a steady, unhurried willingness to hold still and wait, given her the only thing Douglas Hale had never intended for her to have, a place to stop running. She said, "Yes, I was." In the late days of August, Theodora woke before dawn with a certainty that today was the day, and went to wake Clyde, and by noon she had delivered a healthy boy into the hands of Dr. Harriet Sessions, who had come out to the ranch from Harlan's Creek in a buggy driven with the speed and determination of a woman for whom childbirth was both profession and passion. He was named Samuel, after Clyde's father, and he arrived in the world with a full complement of opinions about it, expressed at significant volume, and the dark hair of the Graves family and the gray eyes of the Reed family, and hands that Nora examined with great seriousness and declared satisfactory. Clyde held his son for the first time standing by the east window of the front bedroom in the morning light, and Theodora watched his face and saw something in it that she filed away with the same care she gave to things that were too large to fully process in the moment they occurred. He looked at her over the baby's head and said, "Samuel Graves," as though trying the weight of the name. "He seems like a Samuel," she agreed. "He seems like something that requires a great deal of accounting for," Clyde said. The almost laugh. "I am very good at accounting," she said, and he came and sat on the edge of the bed, and they sat together in the morning light with the baby between them and the hill country visible through the east window, and the sound of Nora thundering down the hallway toward them, already declaring that she had been awake for hours, and this had taken an extremely long time. Life at the Double G in the year following Samuel's birth was full and busy and frequently loud, and contained more happiness than Theodora had previously known was available in one place. Samuel was an easy baby once he discovered that the world contained interesting things to investigate, and by the time he was 6 months old, he was sitting up and grabbing at anything within reach, with the focused determination of a person who has identified a project and intends to complete it. Nora treated him as a combination of fascinating research subject and personal project, reading to him with tremendous seriousness from her McGuffey's reader while he grabbed at the pages with small, decisive hands. Clyde was the kind of father who did not need to announce his devotion, because it was entirely visible in everything he did. He carried Samuel in the crook of his arm while doing accounting on Sunday mornings, holding the baby against his chest with one arm and writing with the other, and Theodora would come into the front room to find them both asleep in the chair by the window, Samuel curled against his father's chest, with one small fist wrapped around the lapel of his shirt, and she would stand in the doorway for a moment before going in and feel the weight of a happiness that still sometimes seemed, even now, improbably large. She had rebuilt her life so many times, in Austin and in San Antonio, and in the small succession of rooms that constituted her existence before Harlan's Creek. She had rebuilt it with great competence and considerable loneliness, and the particular stoicism of someone who has learned not to need things that might not be there when she reaches for them. And then she had arrived, 3 years after all of that, at a limestone house with roses on the porch, and a child who slipped ribbons into her pockets and a man who built things carefully and held them steady, and she had stayed. In the spring of 1884, when Samuel was 7 months old and Nora was 9, and the roses were coming back in on the porch for their third season, something happened that Theodora had not anticipated and had not prepared for, and which arrived, as the best things tend to, without ceremony. She was in the kitchen on a Tuesday morning, early, before anyone else was awake, and she was making the strong dark coffee and listening to the ranch settle into the day, and thinking about the inventory she needed to complete before the supply order went out Thursday, and she realized, with a sudden clarity that was not alarming but was large, that she was home. Not in the way she had been telling herself she was home for months, not the careful, provisional home of someone who has learned not to trust permanence. The actual thing, the complete version, the home you recognize not by its features but by the feeling in your chest when you stand in it before anyone else is awake and the morning is coming and you know, without qualification, that you are exactly where you are supposed to be. She stood at the kitchen window with her coffee, and the light coming up pink and gold over the eastern pasture, and she felt it all the way through. Clyde came downstairs at his usual hour, went to the kitchen, found her at the window, and came to stand beside her with the natural ease of a man who has learned where another person's gravitational center is. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said. He poured himself coffee and stood beside her and looked out at the morning coming over the pasture. "There is a hawk on the far fence post," he said. "I know," she said. "He has been there since first light. He is waiting for something." "Patience," Clyde said. "Yes," she said, "patience." They stood together in the morning light and drank their coffee, and the hawk waited on the fence post, and the cattle moved at the pasture's edge, and the sky went from pink to gold to the clear particular blue of a Texas spring morning, and it was ordinary, and it was everything. In the summer of 1885, 3 years after Theodora Reed stepped off a stagecoach in Harlan's Creek with a broken-latched carpetbag and a terrified heart, Calvin Merritt rode out from Fredericksburg to deliver the final legal documentation, confirming that the breach of promise matter was closed permanently, and that Douglas Hale had formally and irrevocably withdrawn all claims. There was a note from his San Antonio law firm that was entirely impersonal and which Theodora read twice, folded once, and placed in the kitchen stove. And then she and Clyde and Calvin Merritt and Emmett and Frank Collier and Nora and Samuel, who was now nearly 2 years old and had developed a strongly held opinion about being left out of any gathering that included adults, sat down at the long kitchen table and had the best supper the Double G's kitchen had ever produced. And Theodora made the biscuits herself, and they were finally right. Calvin Merritt said, raising a glass of the passable wine he had brought from Fredericksburg as a contribution to the occasion, to the successful conclusion of a difficult matter, and to the considerable satisfaction of practicing law on behalf of people who deserve to win. "To patience," said Clyde. "To patience," Theodora agreed. Nora raised her glass of water. "To Gerald the lizard, who did not survive the winter but who was very important." Everyone drank. After supper, when Samuel was in bed and Calvin Merritt was in the spare room, and the Collier brothers had gone back to the bunkhouse, Nora lingered at the kitchen table with her journal open, writing her entry for the day with the careful, unhurried penmanship she had developed over 3 years of lessons. Theodora was washing the dishes. Clyde was drying them, which was a thing he did without being asked, and which she had stopped being surprised by. Nora finished writing, blew on the ink, and looked up. "I have been thinking," she said, in the tone that meant she had thought about a thing very thoroughly and was now prepared to present her conclusions. "Have you?" said Clyde. "I have been thinking that Gerald the lizard was the first thing I showed you," she said to Theodora. "When you came here, I brought Gerald to your room and showed you him." "You did," Theodora agreed. "And then I gave you the ribbon." "You did." And then I winked at you, Nora said with the complete satisfaction of someone reviewing a campaign that achieved all its objectives. Because I knew then that you were going to stay, and I wanted you to know that I knew. She closed her journal. And you did stay. Theodora set down the dish she was drying and looked at this child. This extraordinary, small, knowing child who had slipped a blue ribbon into a grown woman's pocket and winked at her like it was the beginning of something, which it had been. Exactly that. You were very sure of yourself, Theodora said. Yes, said Nora simply. Because you looked at our roses, and people who look at our roses like you looked at them are always supposed to be here. She picked up her journal, kissed Clyde on the cheek and Theodora on the cheek in the same businesslike sequence she had developed over 3 years, and went up to bed. Clyde and Theodora stood in the kitchen in the quiet after and looked at each other. She is going to be formidable, Theodora said. She already is, Clyde agreed. He hung the dish towel on its hook and turned and looked at her in the kitchen lamplight, and she looked back at him and thought about all the things that had to happen, all the terrible, frightening, forced-choice things, all the hidden motives and dark pasts, and the long road of fear and flight. To arrive at this exact moment in this exact kitchen with this exact man looking at her like, she was the good pasture after a rain, and she thought that it was the most improbable and most inevitable thing she had ever known. "Come here," he said, and she did, and he folded his arms around her in the warm, steadfast way he held everything that mattered to him. And outside the kitchen window the Texas stars were out in their uncountable millions over the hill country, and the roses on the porch were putting up new growth for the season to come. And in the morning there would be accounts to keep and cattle to check and lessons to give, and a small boy who would wake with opinions and a daughter who would have plans. And she was home. Completely and irrevocably home. By the autumn of 1886, the Double G had expanded its grazing leases by 400 acres to the south. The cattle contract with the railroad had been renegotiated to considerably better terms, and Theodora's accounts had been praised by Calvin Merritt as the cleanest ranch financials he had encountered in 15 years of practice, which she chose to take as the high compliment it was intended to be. Nora, now 11, had exhausted Theodora's supply of readers and had begun borrowing books from Mr. Harrington at the land office, who had an unexpected private library and an equally unexpected enthusiasm for lending it to a child who returned books with handwritten notes about their contents tucked inside the front cover. She had also decided that she intended to be a lawyer, a declaration she made with the same serene certainty she brought to all her important decisions, and which neither Clyde nor Theodora treated as anything other than a plan to be taken seriously and supported accordingly. Samuel, now 3, was a sturdy, cheerful child who attacked the physical world with enormous enthusiasm and almost no caution, and who had recently added the word "why" to his vocabulary with a thoroughness that suggested he intended to apply it to every phenomenon in the known universe. He had his father's steadiness in some deep structural way, but he also had a brightness, a quick, engaged delight in things that Clyde would look at sometimes with an expression of soft wonder, as though he could see someone else in it. He told Theodora once, sitting on the porch in the late evening, watching Samuel chase fireflies in the yard with the dogged focus of a child who has decided the fireflies will be caught regardless of what physics has to say about it, that Samuel's brightness reminded him of Clara. Not with grief, not with the particular ache she had come to recognize as his grief register, with something that was quieter and kinder than grief, a recognition, a gratitude. She reached across and put her hand over his, and they sat in the warm evening and watched their son chase light. In the winter of 1887, she told him she was pregnant again, and this time he pulled her into his arms immediately and held her there in the front room without saying anything at all, which said everything. The second child was born in September of 1887, a girl with Theodora's gray eyes and her own specific opinions about the world, which she began expressing approximately 30 seconds after her arrival. She was named Eleanor, for Theodora's mother, and she was called Ellie from the beginning by everyone except Nora, who called her the Project for approximately the first 3 weeks, with a combination of affection and academic interest that eventually resolved into a devotion as complete as anything Nora brought her full focus to bear upon. Samuel inspected his new sister with the thoroughness of a 4-year-old, who has been told a great many times that this is a very important person and has taken this information seriously. He told Theodora that Ellie was very small and very loud, and that he would teach her to catch fireflies when she was bigger, which Theodora thought was exactly the right plan. Clyde held Alina the same way he had held Samuel, at the east window in the morning light, and this time Theodora was well enough to sit up and watch him, and the expression on his face was the same one but layered now with 4 more years of fatherhood and partnership, and the particular depth that accumulates in a person who has been genuinely happy for a sustained period of time. He looked at her over the baby's head and said, "Alina Graves." "She seems like an Alina," Theodora agreed. "She seems like trouble," he said, with a full smile. "The best kind," she agreed. The years that followed were the years of a life in the full sense of the term. Not a life free of difficulty, because no life is, but one in which the difficulties were met from a stable place with people beside you who were committed to remaining beside you regardless of what the difficulty was, and that changes the nature of difficulty considerably. There were hard summers and hard winters. There was a drought in 1889 that tested the ranch's financial reserves in ways that required Theodora's most creative accounting and Clyde's most careful management, and the cooperation of the Collier brothers who agreed, without being asked, to reduced wages for the worst months, and were rewarded substantially when the situation improved. There was a season when the railroad contract fell through for reasons having to do with disputes between the rail companies that had nothing to do with the Double G. And Clyde spent 3 months finding alternative buyers with the methodical focus that Theodora recognized as his response to serious challenge, and which she found, still, powerfully reassuring. There was the year Nora, at 14, wrote a letter to the editor of the Harlan's Creek Gazette about the lack of educational resources for girls in the county, and generated a response of such volume and variety that Reverend Dawes organized a town meeting about it, which resulted in a fundraising effort for a proper school building with a full-time teacher, which was not solely attributable to Nora's letter, but which Nora justifiably counted as a contributing factor. There was the winter Theodora became seriously ill, a lung inflammation that kept her in bed for 3 weeks and frightened her more than she showed, and during which Clyde sat with her every morning before the day began and every evening after it ended and read to her in the quiet, careful way he read everything. And Nora organized the house with the efficiency of a small general, and Samuel brought her things he thought might be helpful: a hawk feather, a smooth stone, various items whose therapeutic value was speculative but whose intention was entirely clear. And Ellie, then too, sat in the chair beside the bed for hours at a time, with the serene patience of a child who has decided her presence is what is needed and has applied herself to providing it. She recovered. She sat up on the first morning she felt genuinely well and looked at the bedroom that had become her bedroom in a house that had become her house in a life that had become her life, and she felt the same thing she had felt in the kitchen on that spring morning years ago, only larger now, seasoned, tested, proven. Clyde came in with coffee and sat on the edge of the bed and said, "Better," and it was not a question. "Much," she said. "Thank you." "You have nothing to thank me for," he said. "I have an extraordinary amount to thank you for," she said. He shook his head. "The accounting is mutual," she laughed. Real, full, the laugh that had gotten easier and freer and more frequent over the years until it was simply part of her. He smiled his full smile, the one she had loved since the first time she saw it in a kitchen in 1882, and she reached up and touched his face, the jaw with its trace of gray now, the familiar landscape of him, and he turned his head and pressed his mouth to her palm and held it there. Outside the east window, the hill country was bare and cold and silver with winter light. And in the front room, she could hear Nora reading aloud to Samuel and Ellie with the professional authority of an 11-year-old who has been reading seriously for 7 years and considers it a civic responsibility. And the house was full of life and warmth and the accumulated texture of years. And it was, in every way that the word can be made to mean its fullest thing, home. There was a day in the spring of 1892 when Nora was 16 and had already begun corresponding with a law school in Austin that was, under considerable social pressure, beginning to consider admitting women, and Samuel was 8 and had his father's steady focus applied to his mother's numbers, and was already keeping a simple account of the ranch's small operations as a personal project. And Ellie was 4 and had recently declared her intention to own all the horses in Texas, which no one in the family treated as an implausible ambition. It was a Saturday morning in April, and Theodora was in the kitchen making the biscuits that were now, after 10 years of practice, exactly right, and Nora was at the kitchen table writing a letter, and Samuel was somewhere outside with Frank Collier, who had married Beatrice's sister in 1888 and had 2 children of his own now, and Ellie was on the porch feeding the chickens with the intense focus of a child who takes all responsibilities seriously. Clyde came in from the barn, stopped in the kitchen doorway exactly the way he had stopped in it 10 years ago, and Theodora turned from the stove and looked at him. He was exactly himself. 10 years of mornings and seasons and difficulty and gladness and the particular compound interest of choosing each other daily, and he was exactly himself, the same steadiness, the same creekwater eyes, the same quality of presence that she had first noticed as you notice a well-built wall and had come to understand was the deepest comfort she had ever known. He looked at her across the kitchen in the morning light. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said. Nora looked up from her letter. She looked between them with the bright, knowing attention she had brought to every situation since before she could write her own name, and then she smiled, small and private and satisfied, the smile of someone who has watched something she set in motion arrive at exactly the destination she intended. She reached into her apron pocket. She produced a small hair ribbon, red this time, bright as the roses on the porch in spring, and she pressed it into Theodora's hand as she passed with her letter, and she winked, slow and deliberate and conspiratorial, the same wink she had offered a terrified woman holding a carpetbag on a porch in 1882, the wink that said, "I know something, and what I know is this, that the right people find each other, and that patience and courage and the willingness to stay are the whole of the secret." And then she went out the front door into the spring morning to mail her letter to the law school in Austin. Clyde looked at the ribbon in Theodora's hand. He looked at the door his daughter had just gone through. He looked at Theodora. "She has been planning something," he said. "She has always been planning something," Theodora said. "She planned this one a very long time ago." She looked down at the red ribbon in her palm. She thought about the blue ribbon in her apron pocket on the day Clyde had come home to find Douglas Hale's confrontation already behind them, already past, already the beginning of the story rather than the end of it. She thought about the forced choice that had turned out not to be a choice at all, because some things are not choices, they are simply what is true. She folded the red ribbon carefully and put it in her apron pocket. Clyde crossed the kitchen and kissed her the way he had been kissing her for 10 years, certain and warm and without the smallest hesitation. And outside the kitchen window, the roses were coming up on the porch for their 10th spring, and somewhere in the pasture Ellie could be heard demanding that Frank Collier teach her to ride the big horse rather than the small one, and Samuel was asking questions. And Nora was striding down the road toward town with her letter and her future, and the absolute conviction of a woman who has always known exactly who she is. The Double G Ranch stood as it always had, solid limestone and painted barn and straight fence lines and roses red along the porch. And inside it, Theodora Graves née Reed stood in her kitchen on a spring morning with red ribbon in her pocket and coffee on the stove, and her whole life arranged around her like something built with great care over a long time by people who understood what they were building. A dark past was something that had happened a long time ago to a frightened woman on a stagecoach. A trap had been sprung and escaped and outlasted. A forbidden thing had been named and claimed and grown into something neither forbidden nor frightening, but simply true. And the hidden motive that had lived at the center of everything, the deep, essential, originally unnameable reason that one small girl had slipped a ribbon into a grown woman's apron pocket and winked like they had a secret, was this. She had known, with the uncanny, unmediated wisdom of a child who has already survived loss and learned to see clearly, that the woman who looked at the roses like that was someone her family needed, and someone who needed her family, and that the only thing required to make it true was for someone to have the courage to begin it. She had begun it, and it had become everything.